Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started with our official panel discussion now. So just to introduce everyone to the audience, I am Shan Tiezi, the editor-in-chief at The Diplomat, and I am hosting and moderating this webinar with our wonderful panelists today. We're joined by Dr. Dino Patti Djalal, who is the chairman of the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and also a former Indonesian ambassador to the United States. So welcome, Dino. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We also have Yuki Tatsumi, who is a senior fellow and the co-director of the East Asia program, as well as the director of the Japan program at the Stimson Center. She wears a lot of hats. And then we have Suhasini Haidar, who is the diplomatic editor at The Hindu. So welcome to you as well. We're very excited to have such a cross-section of voices, journalists, think tank panelists, former diplomat, and we're gonna kick it off. Each of our panelists is going to begin by talking for about 10 minutes about what countries in their regions. Dino is going to cover Southeast Asia, Yuki Northeast Asia, Suhasini South Asia. What are countries in these regions hoping that the Biden administration will do? What are their concerns about the incoming US administration? And then we will have about half an hour for Q&As. Attendees, there's a Q&A section at the bottom of your screens. You can type questions. I'll be gathering them throughout the course of the event, and then I will ask as many as I can in our Q&A section. Okay, so Dino, would you like to start us off? Tell us, what are the thoughts in Southeast Asia as they're watching Biden start to put his team together?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me, Shannon. And The Diplomat is one of my favorite source of foreign policy news, and I do mean it. I check on the website all the time, and I always get good analysis from there. So it's a great honor to be invited here. I think, look, the views towards Trump in Southeast Asia, and especially Indonesia, has not been positive. Yeah, the messaging coming from Washington, D.C. in the last 4 years were unusual to us. The messaging was America first, was felt like America not willing to play an active role or leadership role in the world or in the region. And we were not used to that. We were used to America that had a strong sense of internationalism, the giving America, right, and so on. So Trump administration was not seen in relative to others in such a positive light. I mean, in Indonesia, for example, the Indonesian president had not visited Washington in 4 years, right? Another did Trump, right? And in the election issue in Indonesia, during the elections last year, President Jokowi, I think, made a conscientious attempt to keep a distance from President Trump for domestic political reasons, especially relating to the Islamic constituencies. And he managed to win re-election that way, right? So that's the situation with Indonesia, and at some level too. Before I get into the Biden administration, I was bothered by the fact that there were quite a few politicians in Indonesia locally, and perhaps this is true for other parts of Southeast Asia too, that saw Trump political behavior, the mean-spirited behavior, the obnoxious attitude, and so on, and thought to themselves, hey, this guy could get elected by being that way. And there's a constituency that was attracted to that kind of political behavior. And some of the local politicians here start thinking that way. Maybe the more mean-spirited, the more nasty, the more obnoxious I become, the more votes I would get, right? So there was a slow trend there, and I was a bit worried to see that. And I'm glad that he wasn't re-elected because it showed that that brand of politics would not always work, right? Although he did get 70 million votes in the United States, right? So the Biden presidency was seen as a sort of a relief, and this contrasted with the fact that the last 4 years, American foreign policy under President Trump was seen as not focused, not coherent, erratic, right, unpredictable, and losing some degree of credibility and authority. It wasn't clear. I mean, President Obama had this pivot or rebalance, right? And President Trump touted the Indo-Pacific strategy outlook. But it wasn't clear how much President Trump owned up to it, right? And he didn't show up to ASEAN meetings, right? And he has not even appointed an ambassador, American ambassador to ASEAN, which was seen as his lack of interest in Southeast Asia. So Biden was seen as, hey, this guy has been an old hand in foreign policy. His use of the term that America would like to exercise global leadership is in contrast with Trump's America first, right? And Biden has been saying the right things, and we think that the Biden presidency would signal a renewed American activism in the region, right? So what do we expect from the Biden presidency? I think the number one thing is really on the vaccine diplomacy, right? Southeast Asia has different numbers of casualties. Indonesia has 500,000, for example, but Singapore had a lot less, right? Thailand has a lot less, but all the economies are going down, contracting significantly. Meaning what? All of them are waiting for the vaccine to come to be a game changer, right? So far, China has been very active, courting Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia. China promised 50 million doses of vaccines for Indonesia, right? So for everybody, the foremost thing on their mind is vaccines, because that relates to reversing COVID-19 spread, and about reversing or containing economic recession, right? For the United States to be part of that concern, that solution is very important, right? So if Biden wants to come in and he starts talking about the guns, the boats, the strategic rivalries, it's not going to connect with the immediate needs of the Southeast Asian region. And secondly, obviously, as connected to the COVID-19 crisis, is the economic recovery, right? Every country in Southeast Asia is desperate for a V-shaped economic recovery. And even though that might not happen, a U-shape is good enough. But where the United States position itself in this will be important. I think the message coming from Washington about fair trade is warmly welcome. And I think we expect the United States, although it will remain tough with China on the trade issues, but we don't want this to escalate. And we hope that the economic relations, trade and investment between the United States and China will be under control, will be well managed, and definitely to be less confrontational. As a note, I have about 2 minutes left. In Indonesia, there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, that a democratic administration is an intrusive one, right? Again, this has been long perceptions in the minds of politicians, and I don't know how the Biden policies will play into this. He has talked about launching the League of Democracies. I think some countries will be will respond to it positively. But there are countries in ASEAN, of course, who are very careful about being seen as, being part of a democratic movement that would be confrontational with countries that are non-democratic, right? Because the reality on the ground is that ASEAN way is about accepting and about being friends with everybody, with the major powers, and without making judgments on political systems, right? So that has been the ASEAN creed that has made ASEAN, thrive in all these years. I see my clock is running 30 seconds, but I'll stop there and I'll take more questions later.
All right, thank you, Dino. Yeah, I think we've been hearing a lot about COVID and the economy and China, which I think everyone would have thought these are the top 3 issues we'll be discussing. So let's turn to Yuki now, and we'll have her tell us how Northeast Asia is viewing these same issues and what other issues they're bringing to the table in terms of what they would like Biden to focus on.
Great. Good morning, good evening again, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. And Shannon, again, thank you for having me. It's always great to work with you. And in response to your question, I very much agree with Dino about the initial reaction about the anticipated incoming Biden administration. I do know that especially alliance partners for the United States in Northeast Asia, there was a big sign of relief, right, about more reasonable people or more predictable or stable foreign policy and national security policy hand coming in and taking charge back again. But then as far as I can tell, though, that there are actually I'm a little bit worried about a couple of things that I'm actually seeing in the Japan that actually is very similar to what Dino actually mentioned about what he saw in the local politics in Indonesia. That in Japan, there is still a die-hard Trump fans. And we talk, here in the United States, we keep talking about, these Trump supporters do not accept election results and conspiracy theory just, still raging like a wildfire. And there are certain parts in the Japanese media and more of a conservative wings of those community that really believes in that conspiracy theory. And that I have actually seen Americans living in the United States who's a known, characters in media as a commentator or analyst on those like foreign policy and alliance issues, coming out about, injustice in this election. And it's really striking for me to see that that type of perception really spread wide in this short 4 years of one administration. And then as a result, when I talk to my friends in Japanese government, at least, they apparently do welcome the more predictability and stability in their counterpart. It'll be nice for them to see, not the rolling, chairs of their counterpart as, President Trump keeps firing people. But at the same time, there is this fundamental anxiety that Trump got elected. And even if Biden was re-elected in this election, President Trump still garnered 73 million votes. So what does that say about the overall political trend in the United States? I think 4 years of Trump administration, not just on the initial more, I would say more superficial, if I might even say, on the specific policy decision and policy directions, what they saw in the United States for the last 4 years really gave them fundamental questions about the future direction of the United States as a country. And in that context, they are really seriously thinking about the could be a very distant possibility, but still possibility that United States may not remain as an international order, leader for the international liberal international order, or a stable ally, or even reasonable ally, that they could go back to transactional way in the next election. So I think that is one a very deep damage that last 4 years have done in the U.S. policies and alliance and partner relationship. I would say not only in East Asia, but then probably with the international community writ large. And then I think Biden administration does have a very big job of trying to repair that damage. And to what extent they could repair it, in a sense, we actually won't know the answer to that until what happens in the 2024 election. That would this reasonable line prevail? And then our allies and partners around the world is now finally convinced that that was just irregular 4 years? Or do we then, do they again see us going back to that transactional, unpredictable, unstable, and unwilling United States to unwilling to take a leadership role? So I think that is a big question that will remain unanswered out there for some time to come. But on the short term, I think the countries in Northeast Asia, especially I'm focusing on Japan and Korea here, I think they are relieved that very raw transactional approach to the alliance issue will be replaced by more measured, more reasonable, more predictable, their non-quality kind of approach that's coming out of Washington. And then also, I think for both Japan and ROK, although some segment of the country or bureaucracy were very comfortable with the tough rhetoric that the Trump administration articulated vis-a-vis China. And then I do think that the Trump administration did move the fundamental baseline of the US policy toward China to a more competitive one. And I think that strand will remain in the Biden administration. But at least I think Japan and Korea now have a sign of relief that they will always not be pitted against, it's either me or them. It's not going to be so black and white, and more nuanced approach will come back. And that is so important to them because on one hand, they do have national security concerns about Chinese assertive behavior, but at the same time, China still is their neighbor, big neighbor, and they're a very important economic partner. So just like Southeast Asia, Japan and Korea are not necessarily be put in a place of choosing one side in its totality or the other. So I think that return of the nuanced foreign policy approach and measured approach is a very welcoming thing in the Northeast Asia too. And same thing for North Korea. President Trump had kind of wavered from we're going to go in for the big deal and tried summit a couple of times. And then we really haven't seen too much action coming out afterwards. And that when he realized that the summit has failed. And in the meantime, North Korea continues to build up its missile and nuclear capability. So we will still have to see what types of new or inventive or creative approach that Biden administration can take to get the dialogue toward the dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program back on track. But then I do think that Japan and South Korea now probably will have a more stable partner to work with in the United States. And one big unknown is, like Dino said, COVID. In a sense, Shannon, we know this. We here in the United States are still looking very inward. We're also very suffering economically from this COVID impact. So I don't know how that will translate and how much Biden can bring the foreign policy back to more outward-looking internationalist trend will very much dependent upon how quickly we can really restrain this COVID impact and how fast Biden administration can restart the U.S. economy into the getting out of the recession. So I guess I'll just stop here, and I'll look forward to the questions later.
All right, thank you, Yuki. We're already starting to see some themes emerge. So let's have Suhasini pick up from there, and we'll see if the view looks similar or different from South Asia, and particularly India.
Sure, and remember, South Asia does represent about 25% of the world's population, and it is a population that feels very engaged with whatever is happening in Washington. I'm sure the US results were followed very closely across this region in particular. I agree with Ambassador Jalal when he talks about what Trump was and the idea that Biden will be the anti-Trump. So very quickly, 8 points that Trump was. One, he represented a retrenchment from American leadership, pullouts from around the world, a desire not to get involved in any new conflicts, and certainly he didn't start any wars. A retrenchment from global institutions, the UN, the WHO, the UNESCO, the Human Rights Council, and several other platforms. A retrenchment from commitments that America had made. This was a big break. That commitments that the Obama administration made on the JCPOA with Iran, climate change, missile deals, those were things that Mr. Trump actually reversed. There was the China confrontation, which I think Ms. Tatsumi really put well in terms of how Mr. Trump was seen. And as a consequence of that, what India saw was the Indo-Pacific policy of the US, renaming its Pacific Command as the Indo-Pacific Command, and really increasing at least its gaze on this region. As Ambassador Jalal said, I'm not sure there was a complete understanding of how much commitment, how much money was coming behind all of these moves. But those were clear. Domestically, Mr. Trump was tough on immigration, which means a lot, particularly in India, where just in the H-1B category, Indians make up a good 70% of those who get visas on the basis of that. He was very tough on trade. He withdrew India's GSP status, which was a big issue. He was very easy on human rights concerns. He wasn't very particular, except with China. Wasn't very particular about domestic issues in other countries. And even when you see the way his administration pursued talks with the Taliban, it seemed as if there was nothing the Taliban could actually do that would push them off course from continuing those talks. And the last point was that whatever Mr. Trump's administration did could just be reversed the next day with a tweet. So there was that constant uncertainty that Mr. Biden is going to represent the opposite of. So the Biden administration is essentially going to mean, or has promised, that he will mean the opposite. America is back, American leadership is back, America's involvement in internationalism is back. He's going to try to go back to the JCPOA. And for those who haven't yet seen it, he's given that first interview to Tom Friedman, who has put out some of his views on foreign policy, particularly China, the Middle East. And those are worth seeing. But how much is he going to be able to, reverse some of the Trump administration's policies when it comes to immigration, when it comes to trade? Those remain to be seen, because in a sense, Mr. Biden is bound by a lot of American domestic policy constraints in a year in which the economy is doing so badly, in a year with the coronavirus pandemic taking up a lot of his time. So that really is going to be the deciding factor for South Asia. What Mr. Biden decides to do on China is going to decide, and it's not as if all of South Asia feels the same way, because remember, India is the only country apart from Bhutan in South Asia that's not a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. India is the only in most countries in this region now, except, as I said, with Bhutan, have a higher bilateral trade with China than they do with India or the US. So not everybody will look at Mr. Biden's policy the same way, but it is clear that Mr. Biden's China policy is going to be one of the main things that South Asian countries look at in particular, how seriously he's going to take the idea of the Indo-Pacific, and how he is going to distinguish when it comes. And this is a very important point that has now come up, and Mr. Biden is himself clarifying. that his priorities are America's traditional ally. So in Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea can take heart from the fact that Mr. Biden is speaking really about those traditional allies. But in India, there is the question about then what does that mean for India, which is not an ally? For example, when he spoke to President Moon in South Korea, he actually said, I want South Korea to be a linchpin in the Indo-Pacific policy. Now, South Korea is not even a part of the Quad that included India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. So the question is Mr. Biden going to expand on Mr. Trump's policy here? Is he going to reverse Mr. Trump's policy here? Or is he just going to be sort of apathetic a little bit because he's got other things to deal with? In his interview that I was referring to just now to the New York Times, Mr. Biden has said he does not intend to cancel the phase one agreement that the Trump administration cut last January with China. That he does not see a confrontation with China as inevitable, and that he would do whatever in consultation with America's traditional allies in the region. So these are all spaces that are being watched very closely in South Asia. There are also some other specific things people will look at. I think already both the speakers have spoken about the COVID response that the US brings in, because China has been out there upfront, offering the vaccine, offering all kinds of medical teams in the region, in South Asia as well. And the question whether America will A, offer similar kinds of assistance, but B, will be in a position to help all of these countries with their debt. I think that's going to be watched very closely. When the Quad was first set up, one of its commitments was to offer these alternatives to China's funding in the region, what is being called as debt trapping. But we haven't yet seen that promise being delivered on. And the question is, will Mr. Biden be in a position to do that? Finally, I think in this region, actually finally 2 points in this region. One will really be about what Mr. Biden does on Afghanistan. Now, we know from his previous avatar as vice president in the Obama administration, that he was in fact in favor of a full pullout of the US from Afghanistan, that he was in fact in favor of the reconciliation talks. He's unlikely, one would say, therefore, to reverse much of what Mr. Trump is doing. In that case, the question is, will Mr. Biden follow what the Obama administration was trying to do, which was engage with Pakistan? Or is Mr. Biden going to get tough on Pakistan when it comes to terror? This is certainly a point of interest both in India and in Pakistan. The Trump administration, for everything else, despite the fact that they did work with Pakistan on the Afghanistan talks, also had some very tough measures, stopping the FTF, the foreign military financing, stopping arms sales and to Pakistan, and going fairly tough on Pakistan when it came to its grey listing at the Financial Action Task Force. So another question in the region will be how much Mr. Biden will go ahead on that. And my final point there would be Mr. Biden's made it clear that human rights is back on the agenda for the United States. Democracy is back on the agenda. He hopes to have a democracy summit in his first year in office. What that's going to mean in South Asia is different things. And I think there are going to be some misgivings about that, because in India, the US's intrusive comments on religious freedom, on human rights, Jammu Kashmir are always taken very badly. Not only that, Mr. Biden has a number of people in this administration, including many prominent Indian Americans, including Kamala Harris, in fact, who have been very critical of the Modi government. That's going to be a cause for concern, because the government clearly would not like public sort of criticism coming from Washington. Bangladesh would want more of a focus on human rights, but only on the Rohingya problem. Pakistan would want more of a focus on Jammu Kashmir, not so much on Pakistan's human rights violations, and so forth. So I think the democracy question, while right now is really on the back burner for most people, in South Asia, it will. Sri Lanka as well, which has in the past with the Obama administration, the Rajapaksa regime has had many run-ins. So the democracy question is, I think, going to get some salience as the administration goes on. I'll leave it over there. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for all the panelists. It's hard to give an overview of an entire region in 10 minutes, but I thought you all did a wonderful job. One issue that I would like to talk about that I also saw raised in the Q&A, climate change. Obviously, the Trump administration pulled the United States out of the Paris Agreement. Biden has pledged to re-enter it. He's also setting a target of net zero emissions in 2050. Which follows commitments we saw in Japan, South Korea, and even China. So how important is this issue for governments in Asia? What are they going to think about the Biden administration's approach to climate change? How much of a priority is that for them? And could it potentially be a problem in the case of, for example, India or China, countries that the US might start applying pressure to do more to cut emissions?
Do you want me to start?
Yes, Suhasini, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, sure. Look, at one level, India really took a big risk on the Clinton-Trump election because India assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win and therefore joined the Paris Accord on the basis of a number of commitments made by the Obama administration when it came to funding renewable energies, when it came to all kinds of assistance the US had promised. Clearly, that risk didn't pay off. And a few months later, when Mr. Trump pulled out of the climate change agreement, he actually slammed India along with China for being a great polluter and wanting the US to finance it and all the rest of that. So in a sense, obviously, India would be happy to see a Biden administration come back, although it's by no means clear that those commitments that were made towards the global green fund, the climate fund, that had been planned by the Obama administration, whether those commitments will come back with a Biden rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. There's also some misgivings about his choice of climate change envoy because John Kerry is known in India as a very tough negotiator when it came to the commitments they wanted India to put through on carbon and other issues. And when Mr. Kerry was doing the negotiations as former Secretary of State, he really did have a lot of run-ins with India. In fact, for those who are interested more on the issue, there's an article today by the former Foreign Secretary of India, Shyam Saran, who was India's climate negotiator, talking about how Mr. Kerry's appointment as a climate change evangelist might be a little difficult and he might not be the pragmatic deal maker that India is looking for. So I think on this issue, it's a bit of a mixed bag. India is certainly hoping that the US will rejoin the agreement. India is certainly hoping that the US will make more commitments and even join India and France's led initiative, which is the International Solar Alliance. But not quite sure, what Mr. Kerry's appointment is going to be.
If I can add to that, Shannon, one thing that concerns me is that during the COVID-19 crisis, of the $10 trillion plus stimulus that are being allocated to deal with it, we're not seeing much of a green strategy, green stimulus. Europe has a very strong green component in their stimulus strategy. But if you look at much of countries in Asia, including Indonesia, my own country, the money is being put on stimulus, but you don't see strong green component of it. Almost none on green investments, on sustainability, to drive things away from fossil fuel and so on and so on. I hope the U.S. administration, the Biden administration's reclaiming the climate agenda will help to tilt this balance because the formula is quite simple. If we want to get the climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 10 years or so, we have to reduce emissions by 8% every year for the next 10 years. For the next 10 years, and we're doing well with COVID because people are not driving, people are not flying, and emission will go down 7.6% in 2020. But I don't think this is something that we can maintain because things are going to go back to normal again. And before we know it, in the next 10 years or so, global climate temperature will be 2 or 3 or more degrees Celsius, and that's going to be disastrous. So I hope the U.S. The Biden administration's climate commitment will be one of the game changers that we will see in 2021.
Yeah, if I can add briefly to that, with all the senior foreign policy appointment that Biden transition team has made so far, one appointment that Japanese got kind of sucked their breath between their teeth was the appointment of Secretary Kerry to the climate change envoy. They are kind of embracing themselves to have tough negotiations ahead as he tries to pave the way back, to bring the U.S. back into the Paris Accord. But then there is also a slight optimism that now with the Biden administration, and then again, I mean, this really Biden is also bound by certain domestic forces, but they could, perhaps somehow pave the way to bring the U.S. back into the fold of what used to be the TPP, which is now, clearly, TPP without the U.S. formula. But then I think there is a little bit of a hope that perhaps a road to that may be loosening up. But again, it really depends on how soon and how quickly and how well the Biden administration can get the impact of the COVID within the United States in order. And that, unless that happens, he will not have too much of a wiggle room to play, any different card in terms of a foreign policy. So I probably would be a little bit worried about that for the first year in his office.
Okay, so I'm going to dive into our Q&A stream now. Our very first question, I think, is a very important one, and probably for Dino. What do you think the Biden administration, how are they going to approach the Rohingya issue in Myanmar? Obviously, they've talked more about a focus on human rights, and this is an extremely pressing human rights crisis in Southeast Asia. What are countries in the region going to be looking for in terms of U.S. leadership there?
Well, it's a tough nut to crack, the Rohingyas. I mean, we know what the end goal is. The end goal is to get the Rohingya refugees back to Myanmar, and rhetorically both and diplomatically both Bangladesh and the government of Myanmar are in favor of that. But unfortunately, that's not happening effectively, despite some verbal agreements that they would make this happen. And a large part of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh have not been repatriated back to Myanmar. And I think this is a source of frustration for the Southeast Asian countries that are trying to help the government of Myanmar on this, right? In terms of what the United States can do, look, I think anything that can help with the repatriation would be useful. But again, I don't know how much attention has the Biden administration paid. Will the Biden administration pay on this issue, and that remains to be seen.
Okay, Yuki, do you want to add something?
Yes, so I think on this issue, and especially for this like human rights issue, I think this may be where Japan is hoping to play a little bit more creative role, kind of try to, working with the United States to forge more of a creative path in engaging in these issues in the not just in Southeast Asia but across the world. Obviously, human rights concerns are very important for Japanese government as well. But as we all know, even for Myanmar, Japan has traditionally taken a little bit more flexible, shall I say, approaches when it comes to engagement on those issues. So that I think that is definitely one of the areas that Japan feels like it can work, like it can and is willing to work with the United States to still respecting those fundamental rights and their foreign policy principles in those, and yet, somehow forge a creative path toward finding some kind of a pathway toward the solution. And Japan, I think, does feel that it's traditionally more flexible approach and not so, I guess, democratic principle fundamentalist approach when it comes to this could be helpful. And it's willing to, I think they're very much looking forward to actually working with the United States to help craft something that are more that will alleviate the current crisis.
So another big issue that we haven't talked about in much detail, the peace agreement in Afghanistan, and Suhasini touched on this a little bit. The U.S. is planning to withdraw all its troops from Afghanistan by next year. We have the intra-Afghan talks that are going on now, and now we have a new U.S. administration coming in. So what are countries in South Asia thinking about the Biden administration's approach to Afghanistan? And obviously that's going to have huge ramifications for India and Pakistan as well. So Suhasini, what are the thoughts in South Asia about this important issue?
Well, I mean, the truth is that nobody is expecting the US to stay in when it comes to Afghanistan. But it's a question of what is the US's regional policy going to be from one or two aspects. One, its previous policy, the Trump administration policy, was when he spoke of the South Asia policy, if you like, was that they will deal with Afghanistan, they will push for reconciliation there, they will assist and, in fact, encourage India to take a greater development role in Afghanistan, and they would push Pakistan on ending safe havens for terror and on terrorism in general. That was the theory of what the Trump administration had spoken of. Mr. Biden's, when he was vice president in the Obama administration, had actually discouraged India a little bit from taking a larger, role in projects there because they sort of felt that this would antagonize Pakistan. So the real thing that everyone will look to Mr. Biden for is clarity. What exactly does the United States want to do with Afghanistan? Is the US planning a pullout, which will essentially mean the US is just going away? In which case, the region will have to look to other powers. Already Russia, China, Iran are all engaged very, very intensely in conversations. They deal with the Taliban, they deal with Pakistan, they deal with India. And these conversations are going on. Obviously, they will get a greater salience if the US decision is to completely just pull away and look away from what happens in Afghanistan next. Obviously, an optimistic view of what has happened in Afghanistan is we are not going to see a return to the 1996 takeover by the Taliban, full Sharia law, and Afghanistan heading down that path. Given that they have made such strides in their democracy, given that women have come out in such large numbers into the workforce, and given that there is a whole new generation of Afghans now who are not going to allow a return to that time. Even so, as I said, the most important thing is really over here going to be not only what Mr. Biden does or does not do, but the clarity with which he addresses not just Afghanistan, but the regional ramifications of what is happening, what will happen in Afghanistan. India also has a particular interest in what Mr. Biden does with Iran, because so far India's plans for alternate trade, alternate transit routes to Afghanistan via Iran through the Chabahar port have moved, but not very quickly, because of the continuing sanctions and the new sanctions that come out every few months from the US administration. India has also had to let go of many of its ties with Iran. It no longer imports oil from Iran. It no longer is able to invest in a lot of projects in Iran as a result of the sanctions. So any kind of loosening or any kind of easing of that situation is something India is going to want.
So we've had a couple questions now about the South China Sea, which is always a burning consideration. And I know there are different views even within Southeast Asia, but also Northeast Asia and South Asia. Countries are very concerned about this, but they have different stakes. So what are people expecting or hoping or worrying that the Biden administration is going to do regarding pushing back against China in the South China Sea? And we should probably start with Dino, but then Yuki and Suhasini might have some things to add as well.
Well, for us in Southeast Asia, the key thing is achieving successful negotiations on the code of conduct for the South China Sea. This year, the negotiations has been somewhat disrupted because of COVID-19. They had a first reading of the draft, and they're supposed to have the second reading, but that was postponed because the negotiators did not want to do it digitally, virtually, right? So that had been somewhat postponed. But the key thing to achieve for us is the successful conclusion of this code of conduct. We still have another year. At the end of the year, supposedly, is the target for this document to be concluded. But in the meantime, we hope there's no more provocations done by China or any of the claimants. They keep their self-restraint, things for Indonesia as well. For example, we've been having a row with China because it seemed that some of the 9 dash lines claimed by China overlap with some parts of our waters in the North Natuna Sea, right? So it's been quite complicated for Indonesia as well, because we don't see ourselves as a claimant state. But certainly the bottom line, while we're waiting for negotiations to conclude and so on, the bottom line is really the ability to maintain freedom of navigation in that very important semi-enclosed sea. There should be no move to hamper any freedom and any movement of commerce through the South China Sea by anybody. And China is obliged to uphold it as a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I know it's a critical importance to the United States as well, and of course to the Southeast Asian nations.
Yuki or Suhasini, do either of you want to chime in on this as well?
Yeah, real quickly. So for Japan, I think during the Obama, that is like one thing that Japan has actually liked about the Trump administration's South China Sea diplomacy is more phone-offs. That they felt that during the Obama administration, they talked about, how unacceptable the Chinese assertive behavior was, but they really was not backed up by any actions, and therefore there is this general feeling that that led to the current situation in South China Sea, where there's artificial islands and artificial island continue to build up. So that will be one area that Japan would. My sense is probably prefer to engage them early to make sure that there is the stability of the FONOPS operations, that there will not be a perceived cutback from where things are. And Japan has been doing FONOPS live operation. They're just not calling it as FONOPS, but then Japan has no intention of changing their current tempo. So they very much hope that Trump, new Biden administration will sustain the current level of activities. Not necessarily talking about it all the time in a confrontational way, but they just, keep it up that way. But then also Biden administration coming in, allowing US, Japan, and other partners in the region to approach this in a little bit more coordinated manner, as opposed to, US is doing one thing, Japan is doing something else, and then Australians and Europeans are doing something else. And so there is a hope that there will be a little bit more effort in terms of making sure to coordinate those operations.
The only thing I'd just jump in very quickly and say over here is that there is also the question that we have to figure, the US walking away from its leadership role, if you like, in the previous administration, left us with a big question. Was Mr. Trump actually tougher on China than previous administrations had been? Or was he tough in a bilateral context, but actually made space for China to move in its own region much more? The kind of aggression we've seen from China and in India, we've seen it at the line of actual control in Ladakh, we've seen it at the South China Sea, you've seen it in its operations, the wolf warrior diplomacy, that has actually grown exponentially in the Trump years. So while many think that actually a softer approach bilaterally would embolden China more, there are those who feel that perhaps these last few years of creating these spaces in global leadership has in fact been one of the reasons for China's peculiar behavior that everybody is now today grappling with.
That's a good lead into another question that came in through the Q&A, which is China's treatment of Australia currently. We're seeing pretty heavy-handed economic coercion, effectively banning several Australian imports, more than several at this point, to China, which is a pretty clear warning sign from a country that is the top trading partner for many of these Asia-Pacific neighbors. So how is that playing in the region? Is this going to scare off countries like Japan, Korea, Indonesia, and India from taking a tougher stance on China? And what would they need to see from a Biden administration in terms of support against this sort of economic coercion to tip the scales? I don't know who. Maybe you.
Let me take a first crack at it. I think China is an interesting issue for Japan now. I mean, it has been for some time, obviously. But particularly in recent weeks, because for the first time in a long time, they are actually seeing the actions or initiated on the part of China that's sending Japan a signal that they want to restart their active engagement with the Japan. Like Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Tokyo not too long ago. And he's one of the very few foreign guests since Japan starts the lifting the travel restriction a little bit from outside Japan. And there has been other signs that are Beijing has been sending to Tokyo about how they want to start engaging again with them. And so that is always a conundrum. And like I said in my initial remarks, although Japan does have a deep concerns about Chinese behaviors in security realm, China is an important trading partner. But then, they have already had the history of Chinese kind of economic coercion or attempted coercion into when two countries disagreed. If you all remember, it was, I think, back in 2010 when Japanese government for the first time arrested the Chinese captain of the fishing ship and fishing vessels that body slammed the Japanese Coast Guard ship. China immediately moved to detain a couple of those businessmen who were working in China with the alleged allegation of economic espionage. So Japan has been there before. Maybe not to the degree and scale that Australia is now facing, but Japan has been there before, and they have actually, their response to that kind of wave between administrations. But this is not foreign to Japan. And then I think that there are a broader perception within Japan that yes, China is an important trading partner, but then there are behaviors that is just not acceptable, and then Japan cannot cave into. And that message was very strongly announced and articulated under the Prime Minister Abe, and maybe Chinese government may be hoping that with the new Prime Minister Suga, who's more quiet on the foreign policy issues, less articulate on those, maybe they have an opening to come for a softer approach coming out of them. But as far as I can see, the bureaucracy and national security foreign policy institution that supports Prime Minister Suga really hasn't really waved on that. So at least they're actually, if anything, more concerned about how South Korea is heading when it comes to this.
Yeah. If I can add, thanks for that, Yuki. That was great. If I can add, I think China treats Korea and Japan and Australia and Southeast Asia differently. Yeah. So the harshness of economic response was easier done on Australia, given the view from China that Australia and the United States were most had a strategic rivalry with China. Yeah. They treat Southeast Asia rather differently. I noticed that when we have issues with China, they tend to want to deal with it quietly and sometimes patiently, right? So there have been several issues like that with regard to Indonesia. And even within Southeast Asia, they treat different Southeast Asian countries differently depending on who's in charge. I remember in around 2012 when the Philippines challenged China in the South China Sea, China responded very harshly, sending naval blockades around the area and boycotting the Philippines pineapples and goods and so on. So very punitive, right? But again, they would think twice about doing that to Indonesia, for example, right? So and they had not done similar things to Philippines under the current presidency, right? In my view, I think China sees Southeast Asia as the prize, as a strategic prize, because that's where there's a lot of space still to be had. Yeah, as opposed to Australia and New Zealand or South Korea and China. China feels that they can make a lot more strategic gains in Southeast Asia, and that's why they tend to treat issues and differences and difficulties in Southeast Asia differently than they do with Australia or Japan and Korea.
Did you want to weigh on this, Suhasini?
If I could bring out something very different, because obviously both Ambassador Jalal and Ms. Tatsumi's, this is much more their region. But I think the question that we do have to ask is the kind of measures China is taking today against Australia are essentially trade related. And interestingly, all countries of this region, have 15 countries have signed up now for the RCEP. And this will not only tell us how the future of RCEP is going to be, something that India decided to walk out of last year, but it also tells us whether there are going to be American alternatives, American initiatives that will somehow counter these trends from China. if at the end of the day we have India walking out of RCEP and the US having walked out of the TPP, we didn't even mention that yet, and not necessarily coming back in, although Mr. Biden has made certain noises about it, then we will end up with a fragmented, I don't want to use the word opposition, but a fragmented counter sort of platform to this kind of Chinese behavior. And I think that's something we should all be watching closely.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have because we have a lot of great questions still in the queue, and I'm sorry we didn't get to answer them. But we will be holding more webinars, so there'll be more chances for people to have their questions answered. Thank you very much to our panelists. Very informative, lively discussion. A lot of issues for us all to pay attention to going forward. So thank you again for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.